Today's eventcast is being held as part of the Manhattan Institute's New York City Reborn project and is entitled Turning the Fiscal Tide, Fixing New York City's Finances. Today's panel will feature Don Boyd, Eric Kober, and Andrew Rain, and will be moderated by the Manhattan Institute's Director of State and Local Policy, Michael Hendricks.
Welcome to the Manhattan Institute's event on fixing New York City's finances. I'm Michael Hendricks. We're grateful to be joined by you and some of the city's leading experts on its finances. New York City is in deep water financially. COVID-19's meant a real fiscal emergency for the Big Apple, likely on a scale not seen since the Great Depression. Worst yet, the city's budget entered this year with little room for error and with volatile tax revenues still in place. Subsequent months have seen city officials going for short-term patches to the budget and reaching to the federal government and to the state for short-term fixes as well, whether it be borrowing or bailouts, none of which have come to full fruition. So today we're going to discuss the state of the city's finances and ways that Gotham can turn the fiscal tide. Throughout this conversation, we'd love to hear from you. Enter your questions on whatever platform you're watching us on, and I'll incorporate into the discussion. Now, to turn to our panel, I'm grateful to be joined by Don Boyd, a principal at Boyd Research and a senior fellow at Rockefeller College at the University of Albany, Eric Kober, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and Andrew Rain, president of the Citizens Budget Commission. It's good to be joined by you all. So, Andrew, I want to start with you. How bad is the city's fiscal situation?
Well, Michael, first of all, thank you and thank the Manhattan Institute for hosting this series and this event. And what an honor to be with Don Boyd, one of my teachers about tax policy, and Eric Kober, one of the great public servants of New York City. So thank you for asking me to join today. I think it's fair to say that this is the worst fiscal crisis in generations, but it's important to get under the hood of that and understand it a little more. First, let's look at the numbers. When this was a recession that came on fast, quick, deep, broad, and the city estimated that the tax revenue loss compared to projections was $9 billion over 16 months, 19 billion over 52 months. Taxes have come in a little higher than that, so maybe that was an overestimate slightly, but those are pretty significant. And if you look on paper, the city's now projecting budget gaps of $3.8 billion next year, $3 billion in each of the subsequent years. But it's important to realize that those rely on negotiating $1 billion of savings between the city and its unions, and 5.5 months into the fiscal year, that savings has not only not materialized, zero has materialized. When it should have materialized $1 billion in this year, it hasn't even started yet. So it's really 4.8 billion and 4 billion in those out years. There's potential good news. Maybe not today, but federal aid. I think the governor just said moments ago that he's confident that some will come in the new year, and that would be a great thing. And frankly, if we look at this K-shaped recovery, the top of that K is things that New York relies on in terms of the financial sector and other sectors. So our revenues are holding, even though the economy in many sectors and for many individuals is doing poorly. On the risk side, and there are really 5 important risks: the economy and revenues. It's very uncertain. New York City is particularly ill-suited for a recession of this type because what we thrive on is dynamism, people interacting, people coming here as tourists, businesses working together. Our recession and COVID mitigation strategies have really made that very difficult. So there's still real risk in the economy and the revenues that are thrown off. And I want to just highlight the property tax. The property tax is structured to phase in increases and decreases in values over 5 years, really stabilizing. However, with such a bottom falling out of some of the sectors, look at hotels, look at rental properties, look at some of the other commercial spaces, there's a risk to the property tax, and the controller, because that smoothing puts that risk in 23 and 24 at $1 billion a year, 1.6 billion. But there's even some shorter term risks if those property those value assessments are challenged in the coming year and they're calculated differently, that risk could come earlier. So there's the risk on the economy and revenues and property taxes. There's also the risk of state aid. The state has a budget problem that's significant. $8 billion unspecified cuts this year, $17 billion still to be dealt with next year. Now revenues are a little stronger and there hopefully will be federal aid. But if the state ends up with significant cuts, that rolls downhill. Could I give a route to $1 to $3 billion of state aid cuts to the city? That's reasonable. That's possible. Yes. So that's another risk, state aid. And that also is the combined interrelationship between the state and the city, but also the MTA. MTA's problems become the state's problems. The state's problems become the city's problems. So those all are connected. And finally, there's longer run economic restructuring risks. McKinsey did a study for the MTA and said that subway ridership by 2024 would only come back 80 to 90% of what it was pre-recession. That's because we are in a transitional time. We don't know how it comes out, and that's a risk as well. And finally, there are significant spending needs. Now, we at CBC are staunch advocates of prioritizing spending and focusing and being efficient, but there are some significant needs, and that's also a risk.
So, Andrew, just to dig in a little bit further, do you fear cascading crises? I mean, this kind of layer cake sense of city and state, but also the agencies and the federal government. I mean, all of these kind of fiscal crises interact with one another. Are you worried about these crises interacting in ways that would uniquely harm the city?
Yes, certainly that's true, which is why we have both strongly advocated for the city, state, and the MTA to do what they can on their own to take care of their own fiscal house, but also simultaneously said that we do need some help from federal government, because if those don't come together, as I said, MTA's problems become the state's problem, become the city's problems. They are both on the taxpayer side, the same pockets that pay, but on the fiscal side and intergovernmental relations side, the same responsibilities and cascading, as you say, layer cake effect. So either we turn the tide of the three of those, or they turn together on the worst.
That's fascinating and horrifying too. Eric, I want to turn to you. Do you agree with Andrew's assessment of risks and revenue? And more specifically, give us a sense of how the city has responded so far.
Well, the city has responded so far by kind of muddling through in the way that it usually does in recessions. The city instituted a hiring freeze. It has refinanced debt, which saves it some money. And it has deferred some personnel expenditures from the current fiscal year to next year. And the sort of aggregate of these steps probably gets it through fiscal 21, which is the current fiscal year, which ends on June 30th. There's a lot of uncertainty about fiscal 22, which begins on July 1st. The city is currently projecting a deficit of $3.75 billion. That sounds like a great deal of money, but remember the city's overall expenditures are about $90 billion. So it is a relatively small percentage of the overall city budget. And the kinds of steps that the city takes to muddle through fiscal deficits during recessions may get it through the next fiscal year as well, considering also that the economy may begin to recover as a result of the widespread vaccination. On the other hand, there are all those risks that Andrew just talked about, and there are even more risks. I mean, another risk that the state controller has pointed out is that the city's pension funds may not earn the expected rate of return. And the consequence of that would be that the city would have to make additional pension contributions because interest rates are so low. So there are both sort of downside risks that could make that deficit bigger, and there are also sort of upside possibilities that could help the city muddle through. But it is certainly by no means clear at this point that we will get through at least the next fiscal year without the next mayor having to institute layoffs at the beginning of their term.
Eric, there's a great question from the audience, and I think it gets to a point that Andrew is making. Stanley's asking, is really everything down, every solution really coming down to the federal government stepping in? I mean, is there really no other answer beyond this that will truly address the shortfalls that the local and state governments have, as well as the transit agencies?
Well, the federal government should step in. The federal government has the ability to print money, which state and local governments do not. And New York City is not in the worst shape of any state or local government because its underlying economy is quite strong. But there is there's a nationwide need for the federal government to step in. That said, if the federal government fails to step in, state and local government goes on. And they will have to somehow cope with available resources. The city is required by law to balance its budget. It does so on the basis of what's called generally accepted accounting principles. The city can't balance its budget with short-term borrowing or by not paying its bills until next year because the law does not allow it to do that. So the city will, if it has to, implement layoffs in order to keep its budget balanced. And what we really don't know at this point is whether it's going to come to that.
Don, I want to turn to you. Give us a sense of the revenue side. The city's been muddling through, as Eric said. We're awaiting the response from the federal government. But on the budget side, correct me if I'm wrong, but New York City's revenue situation was a little better than originally expected. But it seems like, as Eric's hinting at, there's more of the story yet to be told in subsequent years. The consequences of what's happened in 2020 will be felt beyond 2020, I imagine, on the revenue side.
Yeah, so there are a couple issues. New York City is not alone in finding that things on the revenue side have not been as bad yet as many people estimated, for example, back in April. The reasons they haven't been as bad, I would put in first the labor market has been stronger than expected. Second, the stock market recovered from those enormous declines back in March, and third, from a revenue perspective, not from a human perspective, but from a revenue perspective, the people who've been hit the hardest have been in lower and lower middle income ranges, often in service jobs, face-to-face jobs, while a lot of other people have been able to continue with life with much less disruption. And so it hasn't hit revenue as hard yet as they expected. That said, there are big risks going forward. So first, for example, the IBO in its latest forecast assumed that infections would have peaked back in May. We know that's no longer true. We don't know what's going to happen with fiscal stimulus. No doubt that's going to depend in part on what happens in Georgia in January. But there may not be substantial fiscal stimulus. We don't know. The cavalry may not come. And then third, over the longer term, most economic forecasts project it's going to be a long time, quite a few years before we get back to the prior baseline we expected. So there's a lot of risk out there, and clearly, should the stock market go down, we've seen before in the Great Recession and in the 2001-2003 mild recession that significant stock market declines have huge impacts on revenue, especially for a city like New York. And as Eric pointed out, already, I think shortfalls relative to expected investment returns and pension funds are likely, but they could certainly be a lot worse. So there's a lot of risk out there.
Don, are you worried about migration away from New York City, especially by high income earners?
Oh yes, absolutely, of course, and we did some work on that together. So first of all, in every public health crisis that there's been in New York City, substantial portions that are able to of the population that have been able to have left the city now. And typically it's the people at the higher income ends who find it a both practical they have the means to leave, and also, less need to stay. Whether they'll return, the history has generally been there've been great returns coming back, but a lot has changed, and so we don't know. So one thing that's changed is that technology makes it easier to work outside the city than before, and COVID-19 clearly broke down a lot of the cultural barriers and institutional inertia barriers to using that technology. So it may well be it is a lot easier to work outside the city from before. And another thing that has changed is the cap on the state and local tax deduction, which makes New York City relatively less competitive in a tax sense than it used to be. And I have notes in my notes somewhere. I mean, Andrew did a great report. CBC did a great report back on this back in the days of when TCJA was being debated. So, for example, prior to the SALT cap, a taxpayer living in New York City with $1 million of income and 2 children paid nearly, $50,000 more annually in combined federal, state, and local taxes than they would have paid if they lived in Florida. But now it would be more at $83,000 more than the Floridian. Just an example, but it makes there's certainly a tax impact that wasn't there before. So that's something to worry about. On the other hand, we have better technology in relation to vaccines. So, there are things that cut in the other direction, but it is a risk for high earners over $100,000, about 17% of the taxpayers, about 80% of the income tax. So should substantial numbers leave, there's a substantial risk. We did some scenarios. I don't think anybody can predict what will happen, but we looked at some scenarios, and in those scenarios in which either 1%, 3%, or 5% of the high earners left and just didn't come back, kind of a one-time leaving, it ranged our estimates about $220 million annual revenue loss to $930 million annual revenue loss. So these are real numbers. You cannot predict with any certainty, but the risks are there, and certain taxes. It's not easy to leave New York City and become a non New York City resident for income tax purposes unless you just sell and leave. But if you're paying the unincorporated business tax, you're a lawyer or an accountant, and you move to your home in your second home on Long Island, you well can do that and not pay that tax. So there are some real risks to the city taxpayers. I'll stop there.
Yeah, so it sounds like we are talking about very real risks, but there's still a lot that we are not sure about. There's still a lot of this year's consequences that we'll still see play out over the next handful of years. Andrew, I want to get back to you. Thinking about where we go next, what are our politically palatable options for the city and its budget, considering those risks? And I say politically palatable because, while there's potentially a lot of options on the table, if you're advising, say, the next mayor on what he or she should do, it seems like they're always thinking about, well, what can we actually get across the finish line? We heard layoffs on the table. Those will certainly be politically contentious. Andrew, what are the options that we think are realistic here, considering the scale of the crisis?
And I do think political palatability is in part contextual and in part about the trade-offs and other options that people have. I think the way to look at this is really 3 options on spending. First, with all due respect, I'll challenge my friend Eric's assumption that we need layoffs. In fact, we have what the de Blasio administration did was add 29,000 full-time equivalent workers, 33,000 higher at its peak than it was at the trough of the last recession, 15,000 higher than it was at the peak before the last recession. So we really built up the workforce, knowing that and providing the opportunity to shrink it. But we can do that with attrition, with a real hiring freeze. The administration finally has put some teeth into its hiring freeze. It needs to be much more aggressive, using attrition to reduce the workforce and baselining those savings in the out years. You can get significant savings. There's enough attrition to allow that to happen so we can reduce the workforce appropriately in a reasonable time period without layoffs. Layoffs are much more disruptive for those individuals, for those families. Sure, you can target it better, but much more disruptive, especially when, as Don described, so many people unemployed, especially the middle and lower income. So we can do it through attrition, but we have to be disciplined. We have to manage it well, baseline those savings. And certainly, we don't have to do an early retirement incentive. The bill in Albany would cost $100,000 for every employee who takes it. And our study on a state early retirement incentive years ago found that 1/3 of those people were going to leave anyway. So we can use attrition, the first strategy. Second is increase efficiency, and there are a number of different ways to do this. First of all, there are managerial prerogatives for centralized changes in fleet management, space management, contracting. Those three together, we estimated, there's probably savings of $100 million there. Then what this administration has not done significantly is gone to its agencies and said, what are your savings proposals? What are your savings proposals? I was executive deputy commissioner of the health department. I was there for 7.5 years. I did, I think, 14 rounds of savings programs, 14 rounds of pegs for those of you who follow this stuff. So there was that discipline. And part of climbing any mountain is how big the mountain is. And part of it is, are you in good shape? And the city has gotten a little out of shape in trying to figure out these things. So there's savings throughout the agencies, and that's what should be happening, and ideas produced all the time. There are also efficiency savings to be negotiated with labor. Right now, our sanitation trucks aren't full when they're done with their routes for the most part. It's inefficient. Well, the challenge is you should lengthen those routes, but you can't unless you negotiate with labor. You need to come to agreement on lengthening the routes and that they should cross sanitation districts. All these contractual constraints decrease efficiency. So reduce the workforce through attrition, increase efficiency, and finally, and as you say, politically palatable. Now is the time, since layoffs are a terrible option and other options also are harmful. We can go back to tax increases, but city employees do not contribute, for the vast majority, contribute nothing to their health insurance premiums. That is different than state employees, different from other public sector, different from private sector. We've modeled a couple of different scenarios where if employees contributed even at a lower rate than the city could save $600, $700 million a year when phased in. The same with retirees who have very generous benefits. We did one model showing that we could save $250 million a year if they contributed like other public sector, and certainly even more generous than private sector, meaning they would contribute less than private sector employees. If we did that, and there are other options on health benefit contributions, we could save significant money. So there are those on the spending side, and if you want to talk, we can talk more about the tax side, as Don said. But those are risky things to do right now because people might leave or people can't pay, and those are two very great challenges.
Eric, I want to get your response in just a second, but Andrew, we have a question from the audience here that I think is a good one. So if this is from Alan, if the payroll has grown by so much, tens of thousands of new workers just during Mayor de Blasio's tenure alone, what sort of signal does that send to the federal government if there's really no cuts to that greatly increased payroll in a time of crisis? Does that send the right signal to federal lawmakers that New York City is taking this crisis seriously? If no layoffs are instituted?
Well, I think that there are actions, as I outlined, that the city is not taking and should take. I think the more it does that, the more it will have its fiscal house in order and the better signal it sends. That still doesn't mean that there isn't need for federal aid in the city, and frankly, many cities and in the state, and for other transit agencies and other public entities. But do I think the city should take those actions because the federal aid isn't there yet and will not take care of the whole problem? Yes. But I think that the situation is serious enough that those at the federal government can see how dire it is and hopefully will come through for not just New York City and state and MTA, because of course that's what we focus on here, but there are other public agencies, and there is more and more research showing that public agency retrenchment hurts economic growth. And so you need the right balance. You're right that you need to send those signals. You need to do the right things, and everyone needs to participate. But there is some evidence there, and there is pain around the country.
Eric, you just came out with a report on trimming New York City's budget bloat. What did you find, and what are your top line recommendations for the city?
Well, what I found in the report is that the city has a sort of brilliantly designed tax system, which in good times allows spending to grow very rapidly. Uh, the tax collections tend to grow at faster than the rate of inflation, and that allows that allows expenditures to also grow much more rapidly than the rate of inflation. It's one of the reasons why the city has been able concurrently both to increase employment, increase the number of city employees during the de Blasio administration, at the same time give them pay increases that outpaced both state and local governments nationally and the private sector, both in New York City and nationally. And the the sort of fundamental base on which this arrangement is built is the high value of real estate, because the real estate tax grows faster than the city's other tax sources as a result of reassessments, really not as a result of rate increases. And the this continual excessive rise in real estate values is really threatened by the very sort of significant structural changes that are taking place in the context of the COVID pandemic. Midtown commercial space is probably not going to increase in value because, at the same rate, because rents are, at least for a while, going to be declining as a result of businesses wanting less space because fewer people will be coming to the office, and probably they will be working at home more of the time, so they will need less space, and that's going to depress rents. Similarly, if some part of the high-income population decides it no longer needs to live in New York City, that's going to depress residential real estate values as well. And those are the two sort of primary sources of the city's real estate tax bonanza. So it's likely that the city's revenues will not be growing the way they've been growing, and the city needs to institute measures to ensure that its expenditures don't grow the way they've been growing either. Part of that is not to replace the people who are being attrited under the current hiring freeze. If the city chooses to do an early retirement incentive, it's critical that those people not get replaced. If you provide an incentive that's worth $100,000, for example, per departing employee, you only save money if you don't replace those people. The city needs to look at productivity measures. The sanitation, Andrew talked about one aspect of sanitation. Another aspect of sanitation is for example, is one-person truck operation, which happens in many other cities. Requires that the garbage be binned rather than left out in bags on the street, and then the one-person truck has a mechanical lift that lifts the bin up and overturns it and drops the trash into the truck. The New York has not adopted that technology, and it's long since time for the city to do that. Another example is that Mayor Bloomberg tried to close a number of fire companies back about 2011 or 2012 in the last recession. The number of structural fires had been going down for a long time, and there was a logical consequence of that was to reduce the number of fire companies. He failed because of political opposition, and there is still that problem. The city simply maintains too many fire companies for for its needs. It's a political third rail. It has been, but nonetheless, these are the kinds of right sizings of city government that enable the city to cope with a
Eric,
reduced
I
level.
wonder about about politics. So, I know it's often too easy to make unions enemy here. This question is not meant to make unions the enemy, but we clearly bring up labor negotiations, and there's clearly difficulty when people's jobs are at stake. If you were, let's say, an advisor to the mayor, and you heard that, let's say, Governor Cuomo was going to use the Financial Control Board to force labor negotiations, to force decisions on the city's budget, which the state has potentially the authority to do, would you say that that's a good thing, or would you be worried about the state using their power over New York City's finances in that way to bypass political obstacles?
I think that's it's a bad idea. The state legislature under the law can reinstate control board control over the city's finances only if the city runs an accounting deficit of more than $100 million a year. And I think that every mayor is going to be very careful never to get there. That's why I said before that although layoffs are clearly not a desirable way to manage the city's deficits, a mayor who is faced with a choice between giving up control of the city to the control board and laying off employees is likely going to choose layoffs, because giving up control of the city to the control board is just an admission of failure to responsibly govern the city. So I don't think control board control should happen. The current mayor and the next mayor take the right steps, but I think that there are ways to manage the transition to more technologically sophisticated ways of operating the city that don't necessarily involve people being laid off. It doesn't involve fewer people being hired. But for example, we talk about one-person truck operation. It could be phased in so that rather than sanitation workers being actually laid off, it would simply mean that fewer would be hired over a period of time in order
Andrew,
to right-size the force.
Andrew, I will turn to you, Don, but Andrew, if you had a message for Governor Cuomo's role, considering his role vis-a-vis the city, what would it be to help the city's budget rather than hurt it?
Well, I think there are a number of different aspects. I think three things I would note is the governor is essentially oversees the Financial Control Board, which right now monitors the city budget, doesn't have power under any circumstances. The state legislature would actually have to enact a control period for the control board to have the powers that it used to have in the old days. But I think the control board should be monitoring on a quarterly active basis when the financial plan modifications come out, to hold the feet to the fire and have transparency. And we at the Citizens Budget Commission have said if the city resorts to borrowing for operations, there should be a number of conditions, preconditions and conditions if they do that, and enacting a control period would be one of those conditions. Second, I think that the mayor and the governor are partners in allocating resources in effect. Of addressing the people's needs. We have urged the state, when it reduces education aid, if it needs to in this budget, or when it increases it in other times, not to be sending more aid to wealthy school districts that can self-fund a sound basic education. Right now, the state sends $1.6 billion approximately to districts around the state that can already, with their own resources, they do fund the New York State constitutional requirement for a sound basic education. We shouldn't be spending money there. That's another way, is focusing the actions where they're needed most. And in certain places, that means relieving the city of some of its obligations to absorb those cuts and supporting the city.
That's fascinating. I do want to get to the revenue side. So Don, first of all, there's a question from the audience. Give us a sense of the hierarchy of revenues. Where does the city get most of its revenue, what's the second and third greatest sources, and then what are the city's options in terms of being able to either boost revenue or make the procurement of revenue more efficient or fairer. What are our options? You've written on property tax reform before, so I think you're a good expert here. So first of all, what's the hierarchy of sources, and then what are our options on the revenue side?
Well, of course, the property tax is the most important, and the income tax and sales tax. The income tax about 22.5% of the city tax revenue, and then the sales tax. But I actually think some of the other folks on the line are probably more expert on the distribution of the revenue. The city has relatively little unfettered control over its revenue. It needs the state to act. If you want to change the income tax or the sales tax, by and large, you need the state to act. The property tax is different. Within tax limits, you have much more flexibility as far as rates are concerned, although again, there are things that have to go to the state in the property tax as well, and I'm sure that Andrew is probably more capable of speaking to that than me. So it's hard. I mean, you can audit, you can try to make sure that you get every dollar that's the city's entitled to under the law, and I think the city is in fact quite aggressive, and probably will be quite aggressive, frankly, in the to address COVID escape. That is, to make sure that folks don't easily get to claim non-residency if they maintain the pretty hard to avoid requirements of residency when you still maintain a city residence. And even on the case of the unincorporated business tax, the city may have ability to do some auditing to ensure that they collect what's due there. But I think I'll stop there because I suspect others can answer parts of this question better than me.
Andrew, I'm sure you have thoughts on this as well.
In terms of the, I have a few thoughts. In terms of the allocation, the property tax is around, I'm just pulled my handy dandy cheat sheet, so pardon my eyes wandering, $31 billion from property tax out of the $60 billion. So, it's around half of the taxes, and personal income taxes at 12 billion, and next being sales taxes at 6.7, general corporate taxes at 3.4. So you kind of go down the hierarchy. And as we've talked about, because the property tax is so much in the way it's structured, it stabilizes our revenue system. Don's exactly right. The property tax is the only thing we can control part of ourselves, and that's the rate. So if you need more money, you can raise the rate. But the reality is the property tax is this Byzantine set of calculations that's archaic and has not been reformed in generations, decades. And we need comprehensive property tax reform because of our structure. We have to compensate with incentives to develop. And then you have people wanting to layer on things like a pied-à-terre tax. Instead of having comprehensive reform that could increase equity, increase transparency. If you wanted to have a homestead exemption, so certain people who are residents paid more than people who were non-residents, you could do that within comprehensive tax reform, and deciding whether you wanted revenue neutral or raise revenues, that besides the point, you could do those things. The problem with our property tax system is it causes so many different distortions that we then keep working around. So that's, one of the important agendas, thinking to the future, because this is the time to not only think about today, but CBC is always talking about thinking about the future, because every choice we make, it has future implications.
Right. So thinking beyond what is politically palatable for a moment, and just looking at what is difficult but good, the never let a good crisis go to waste kind of reforms. It sounds like property tax reform is one of them. It's very hard. We clearly haven't touched this in a long time. Just made it more complicated, probably for a reason. Are there other solutions like that would be hard, but likely good and necessary for the city to engage in, either the revenue side or the spending side?
Yeah. We've been thinking about what, in my mind, is the post-pandemic public sector. We, by necessity, and the discussion we've had today, a great one, talk about the fact that we will have lower revenues. We'll have less money to fund our our spending. So we've got to figure out how to, by necessity, reduce the spending, but by opportunity, revamp the spending. We should be looking at places where policy can be more effective than programs are very expensive, feet on the street, doing stuff, direct service. But look at the natural experiments with like outdoor dining and other deregulation. We should utilize the lessons of these natural experiments for deregulation. We should also be thinking about how technology can change customer service, whether you're a recipient of services, social services. Should there be a comprehensive case management system within government and outside government so we can coordinate for people better? Should we finally figure out how to coordinate our inspections on businesses and buildings and restaurants so that you don't need 12 inspections to open your restaurant? Another piece, we have got to change the labor relations dynamic, both civil service and labor relations, not only to provide flexibility for management and restructuring, and that really should happen, but to provide stability and opportunity for people who want to go into public services. Eric and I did, and sometimes it does not allow people to achieve what their potential is. That should not happen. And there are some, great labor leaders out there who realize this. When I look at what's happening at health and hospitals with some jobs changing and the collaboration there, that's really important. We need to change those labor relations. Fiscal management, we've finally got a rainy day fund enacted in the state, but we need the right constraints at the city level. Mandatory deposits into a rainy day fund during the good times and withdrawal rules during the bad times. You shouldn't take a rainy day fund and use it when you're growing. You should take it for a rainy day. It's kind of simple. It's kind of in the name, but we need those rules, which the state didn't enact as stringently as they should in the city. If we had had a rainy day fund right now, as CBC had proposed structure, we would have literally had $6 billion extra in reserves and a government that was $2 or $3 billion smaller. We would be having a different discussion just today if we had that rainy day fund. And finally, I do want to say, for lack of a better word, future proofing. We've got to think for the future about the next pandemic and the next Hurricane Sandy. And I would say if we come out of this without that, and I think we came out of Sandy, we haven't changed as much as we should have. We're going to be sitting there scratching our head in some period of time and saying, we shoulda, coulda, woulda.
And those are all great ideas. And it's fascinating to me how in good times we say, well, there's no crisis, we're fine, we don't need to reform. And then in crisis times, we say, well, it's not a good time for reform. We need to wait for some future moment. But it seems like that time is here. Eric, what's on your wish list? Thinking less about what is politically palatable, but understanding that when we talk about budgets, we're not just talking about numbers and figures, line items, just pure accounting. We're also just talking about what is government for, who is it for? Those kind of big picture questions are also at stake when we talk about dollars and cents. So what's on your wish list? Eric.
I mentioned a couple of things. One is excuse me.
It appears that Eric,
one thing that I
your
would mention
connection
is
may be down.
the city needs to start
or
growing
slowing
again.
down at this moment.
And when Mayor Bloomberg took office in
Apologize, Eric. I'll come back to you in just a moment. Dawn, I'll turn to you here. What's on your wish list, considering the conversation's just come?
Sure. So we're, of course, talking about not necessarily politically palatable. I mean, any economist will tell you first with regard to taxes, maybe not any economist, lots of economists would say, often on left and right, broad bases, low rates. There's a reason that's a mantra. It's a mantra because it reduces the incentive to avoid or evade taxes by having lower rates. It reduces the ability to avoid and evade taxes because you can't simply go to a similar like product that's untaxed or a similar like kind of income that's untaxed. And therefore, it's less distorting to the economy. Most tax policy in states and cities around the country is the exact opposite. So it's a steep political hill to climb, but that would be Really important. Now, in the property tax, I mean, what comes to mind for me would be the treatment of co-ops versus condos. Income and sales taxes, it means broader bases, and treating like kinds of transactions and income similarly. I saw a question related to taxation of pension benefits in New York. Let me just quickly talk on that. In my opinion, there's no question. Income is income. It should be taxed. However, we have a constitution that gets in the way of that, which says you can't tax essentially the public sector pensions, or certainly that's the way it has been interpreted. Once that happens, there's a federal court case that says, well, you can't treat federal employees any less generously than you treat your own. So now federal employees, their pension income is not taxed. Then for kind of obvious political reasons, the federal and state and local employees don't have taxes on their pensions. Well, you have to have some kind of pension exclusion for private sector employees. All this is this cascading effect. Now, dealing with that in the political world is next to impossible. That's one of the reasons we are where we are. But those are the kinds of things. Looking for horizontal inequities that you can fix and make the tax system more fair at the same time.
And Don, maybe you don't have an answer to this, and that's fine. But at the federal level, you talk to folks on the Hill, and they say, well, if aid is going to come, we want to make sure that aid is not a bailout. And we may, especially if you're right of center, right on the right side of the aisle, they're going to say we may want to include some strings. We want to attach some strings to this aid in order to induce reform. If you're talking to somebody on the Hill, would you give them any advice on how to incentivize reform, or will you just say attaching strings to aid is a bad idea?
Well, right now we're in a crisis. I mean, I feel you need to be careful about the strings you put on, because things are likely to be drafted in haste that aren't going to work very well. I fully understand the notion of somehow trying to say, how much of this did you bring upon yourselves, and therefore maybe we try not to pay for that piece of it. But those things are really hard. They'll be implicit in the political formulas. I guess I would urge caution on the strings. I do think in one area that I studied deeply, at some point there should be rules, and it may be only the federal government that can establish those rules for much better transparency around the true costs of those items. So I think there are roles for the federal government. I would just urge caution.
And Andrew, I will get to you on options for the federal government, but Eric, I want to get back to you. If you're going to have been fixed, would love to hear your wish list for New York City reform.
Sure. I think one of the major issues that we have is we need to resume growth. That all of these fiscal issues become a lot easier when the city's tax base is growing. And Mayor Bloomberg, when he took office in 2002, made growth a high priority. He instituted some major zoning actions that have induced a tremendous amount of growth. Rezoning such as Hudson Yards and West Chelsea in Manhattan, downtown Brooklyn, and Greenpoint Williamsburg in Brooklyn were all very successful at inducing growth, and that growth feeds back into city tax revenues. And one of the important priorities, I think, for the next mayor is going to be getting back on a growth track that I think housing is going to be probably follow that, because we're not going to get a lot of new office space in the coming years for a while until the office market recovers, and resumption of growth is extremely important. Another point I think that haven't talked about, I talked about in my report, is the importance of shifting some of the things that the city does to the private sector. If if we can do that. The city it hires somebody, it not only pays them a salary, makes very promises in the future to give them a pension and to give them post-employment health benefits, which are particularly expensive if people retire before they hit the Medicare age, as they're permitted to do in the city. When you shift expense, you avoid keeping it in balance. One of the points, for example, the city in the last couple of decades has experienced a very large department, mainly employs lawyers. Services of lawyers are obviously provided very extensively privately. And there's a real question about whether, given the long-term obligations that the city incurs, whether those kinds of things that aren't specifically sensitive or sort of unusual things that only city governments do, that some of those things could be shifted to the private sector.
Andrew, there's a lot in what Eric just talked about that I know you can respond to, whether in privatization or strings attached. But I also think he raised a good point on growth, that we can fiddle around the edge here with the budget, but if we don't return to a state of economic growth, everything else becomes much harder. I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
Yes, very, very much. He's exactly right. And in fact, no time is more important than how to pull us out of where we are now. One of my colleague Sean Campion did an excellent report on boosting housing production. Housing affordability has been a real issue in New York. As we know, growth has been a real issue. In fact, we are producing and have produced for the last decade less housing than other of our competitor jurisdictions. Yeah, we see these towers and they kind of stand out at us, but we have not throughout the city of different types of housing, different types of geography. And there are a specific set of recommendations that we made to plan for growth, zone for growth, maybe as of right 2 or 3 family. There are maybe along transportation corridors. We can really zone so that we can, in a targeted way to preserve neighborhood character, still growth, and that would help our affordability. And there are also a state component of that. Other states have incentivized suburban transit-oriented development, so there can be mixed income and mixed use housing near transit hubs. That would help the New York City's economy. It would help decant some of the housing shortage that is frankly in New York. Shortage is not good. Development is good for the economy, and shortage and more development is also good for affordability. So there are state issues of encouraging suburban development. The state has a fixed floor to area ratio which constrains development. There's a scaffold law that increases development around 7%, it's estimated. There are a whole host of proposals in that paper, and Eric's exactly right. If we plan for growth, zone for growth, we can do that, and this was in the housing area. But frankly, also, our land use decision making is broken. We need to preserve the balance between citywide needs for growth and neighborhood needs for stability. We can do that better, but we haven't. If you look at what happened at Amazon, if you look what happened in Industry City, if you look at what happened on some of the objections to infill development on NYCHA land, which would have mixed income housing developed on underutilized land on the Housing Authority land, could have actually thrown off money to help fix NYCHA, which has a $40 billion capital program. So we need to make those land use decisions in ways that balance the city and the neighborhood needs, but also focus on creating jobs, creating growth.
And I know that this is all music to Eric Kober's ears as a planner for the city. I know that Eric's going to be coming out with a paper soon on planning priorities for the next mayor. I got a sneak peek of this. And one thing that was fascinating, Eric, from what you found, was that for every one new job that New York City's created over the past decade, we've only built 0.3 new housing units. One new job, 0.3 new housing units, maybe 0.5 across the entire region. But that difference is really made up with northern New Jersey. And somehow you have to, at least during pre-pandemic times, get from northern New Jersey into the job centers in New York. And that also is becoming increasingly difficult. I imagine, Eric, you would agree on the housing front. We need more houses where there's demand.
Totally. We are very much relying on the benevolence of Northern New Jersey in building a lot of housing, a lot more housing per capita than we build in New York City, and we really shouldn't. We should be aiming through all kinds of land use changes, regulatory changes, to build enough, as much housing as we could possibly do on our side of the Hudson, and also to take advantage of the private sector and private financing, and not place a burden on city government to be the financier of last resort for housing, which it is going to be in a poor position to undertake in the next few years.
Well, let's get some final thoughts here. I'll start with you, Dawn. If you had one big idea for restoring growth, we just talked about housing. What would that be for New York City? What's on the top of that list?
You know, I think I'm not as familiar with the regulatory environment of New York as the other folks. You know,
It seems like making it easier to navigate the tax and business environment is certainly part of that. Taxes, I think, are part of the conversation that we're having about the attraction of other competing states like Florida and others, right?
Well, sure. I mean, you know, it's important to have a tax system that's you know, easy to comply with and not, you know, burdensome in its regulations, for sure. I mean, so that would certainly be part of it. But I'll let others more informed speak.
Eric, I know we just talked to you on housing. Is there one other big idea on returning growth to New York City that you would call out for our audience?
Well, I think you know, the big point that I tried to make in my last paper is the importance of right-sizing the size of this city's workforce. I think that you know, what we would like is that the next mayor would be able to say that we pay our people well, but they're as productive as public employees are anywhere in the world. They use the best technology and state-of-the-art techniques and operating practices, and they're well paid. But we get good work from them and good output, and put it into this notion that the city has to continually expand its workforce, even though other local governments across the United States are using technology to be more productive with the same number of people.
Andrew, growth, how do we get there? You mentioned housing. What's on your wish list for getting us back to growth?
I'll talk a little more conceptually for a second, since we're wrapping up, if I may. What has kept New York growing is dynamism, is change. Stagnation is terrible for this city. Dynamism is great. Part of growth is the partnership between the public sector, the private sector, social service sector, cultural sector, labor unions. What I would say is most important now is for the mayoral candidates and for the new candidates for the city council, be thinking about how, especially for the mayor, lead that partnership, work together among those groups to say, we need to grow together, because we either grow together or however you want to characterize the other, which is not what the future of New York is about. So it's about that leadership to bring people together so that we make decisions that are actually pro-growth, pro-human, pro-stability, the needs of New Yorkers for both their daily needs and their future needs.
We need dynamism, we need leadership, and we need a return to growth for New York City. That is really the answer to our finances, along with all these other ideas that we've heard today. Andrew, Dawn, Eric, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. If you like this event, please consider subscribing to our newsletters or giving to our mission. These discussions and our ideas depend upon you. Thank you again, and thank you to my co-panelists.
Thank you.